David Karr, who's behind me here, is not a name widely known today. Yet his fantastic story is the stuff of a classic American novel of worldly success corroding the soul. He had controversial careers in journalism, government, bureaucracy, public relations, corporate proxy wars, as CEO of a major American corporation, a Hollywood and Broadway producer, a hotel magnate, and an international financier and businessman. He popped up at key moments and important places, next to such significant figures as Alan Cranston, Drew Pearson, Armand Hammer, John Tunney, Ted Kennedy, and Sargent Shriver. He preoccupied J. Edgar Hoover, and he hobnobbed with Aristotle Onassis and political movers and shakers in France and Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a document leaked from KGB archives identified him as a Soviet intelligence asset. Wherever he went, controversy followed. Often, it was about his flirtation with communism as a young man and during his first decade in Washington, D.C. Later, it involved claims of unethical business practices. At the end of his life, it focused on how he had made himself such a key player in negotiating business deals with the Soviet Union. Immediately after his death in Paris, the French press speculated about whether he had been murdered. And several years after that, a British writer argued that he had plotted with Aristotle Onassis to murder Robert Kennedy. He was capable of being charming and establishing warm relationships with titans of business, such as Louis Rosenstiel of Schenley Industries and shipbuilder Henry Kaiser, and politicians like Vice President Henry Wallace and Senator Scoop Jackson. A former French ambassador to the United States, who later became a business partner, remembered him as, quote, always very nice and very kind. I never saw him offend anyone, end quote. The former head of the Anti-Defamation League called him one of the good guys. Yet many of those who knew him best loathed him. One of his ex-wives wrote, quote, he made people feel disposable, like a piece of Kleenex, end quote. The famous sociologist Daniel Bell thought he was, quote, slightly pathological, slightly slimy, end quote. One of his public relations colleagues called him, quote, a vicious, vile scoundrel who worked both ends against the middle, an inveterate liar, a fat slob, a devil, a twisted sick mind, a loathsome work, a hollow drum, an evil son of a bitch. I was interviewing him on the phone and frantically scrambling to write down the insults. Karr's story, the improbable journey of a young man born into a middle-class Jewish home in New York in 1918, who barely graduated from high school, to a luxurious Paris residence and a multi-million-dollar fortune, was, according to his one-time colleague on the staff of columnist Drew Pearson, Jack Anderson, the inspiration for the hit Broadway musical, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, that chronicled the astonishing rise of a window washer up the corporate ladder to boss. Westbrook Pegler, the acerbic conservative commentator, had a less rosy view of Karr's meteoric rise from youthful communist to successful capitalist, describing him as a man, quote, with colossal gall and indomitable impudence, a flexibility not given to most men. A newspaper colleague said he was known, quote, for getting around as quick as an octopus on roller skates, end quote. And Senator Joseph McCarthy provided the most sinister interpretation of his activities, claiming on the floor of the United States Senate in December 1950 that Karr was a Soviet agent. He denounced Karr and his boss, Drew Pearson. By this account, Karr carried the party's orders to Pearson The two were, quote, the grease monkeys of the communist conspiracy that is trying to conquer us. Everything they touch is smeared with the filth of their hands. The blackness of their lies is mixed with the bloodshed of American boys, end quote. While my book demonstrates that charge to have been untrue, I did find evidence that in the 1970s, David Karr did become a source for the KGB, providing information about prominent American politicians. He was not your typical American CEO. Chronicling this complicated, slippery character's life was an obsession of more than 30 years. It involved visiting numerous archives, interviewing dozens of his acquaintances, co-workers, and enemies, those family members willing to talk about him, and trying to get former intelligence agents to talk. The result is not complete. Some relatives refuse to cooperate. Some papers remain inaccessible. Some records, particularly in the files of the KGB and the Israeli Mossad, yes, he was also connected to Israeli intelligence, are still sealed, but enough is available to tell much of his amazing story. David Katz, he changed his name to escape anti-Semitism, was born in Brooklyn in 1918 into an upper middle class Jewish home. His father was a jewelry manufacturer and an importer. David was an indifferent student, frequently ill, barely able to graduate from high school. He held a series of low-level jobs for a few years while pursuing his dream of becoming a newsman. It was not the Depression, but the rise of fascism that pushed him to the left. Alarmed by the growing presence of Nazis in New York, the German-American Bund was actively recruiting and holding rallies. Karr wrote a story about its leader, Fritz Kuhn. That story led him to writing for the Daily Worker, the official publication of the Communist Party of the United States, and working for communist organizations. Karr quickly became part of the communist world. Years later, he denied ever joining the party, while several communists who knew him insisted he was a member. In the late 1930s, he landed a job writing for a radio news service and was recruited to work in Franklin Roosevelt's re-election campaign at a time when the Communist Party of the United States was opposed to FDR because of his support for American rearmament, a sign that the Nazi-Soviet pact might have cooled his ardor for communism. Yet he continued to correspond and be friends with well-known communists. After Pearl Harbor, he was hired by Alan Cranston, a future United States Senator from California, at the Office of War Information to work with the American Foreign Language Press, explaining the war effort and ginning up support among its constituencies. On his application, Karr noted that he spoke and read Spanish and French and also spoke German. All blatant lies. His tenure with the Office of War Information was controversial. An FBI security check turned up evidence of his past communist associations and triggered unease. Editors of several Italian and Hungarian language papers complained that Karr had pressured them to support communist resistance groups in their native lands in the interests of war unity. More seriously, Congressman Martin Dies, chair of the House Un-American Activities Committee, whom Karr had previously savaged in an article as a fascist, named Karr as one of a number of communists working in the American government. Under investigation, Karr denied everything, and he claimed to have been reporting on the Communist Party to the FBI, assuring the Dies Committee that J. Edgar Hoover himself would vouch for him. J. Edgar Hoover was not amused by this blatant lie, and an FBI search of its records concluded that during most of his contacts with the Bureau, Karr was trying to get information from it, not provide it. Karr managed to skate by but his career at the Office of War Information was effectively over. He was encouraged to resign in 1943, just before the Civil Service Commission recommended that he be fired. He tried to get a job with the American Jewish Committee, but their offer was rescinded after it learned that he had lied about his government salary and job title. Karr soon went to work for Drew Pearson. His successor as Pearson's chief legman or assistant, Jack Anderson, lauded Karr as, quote, the most articulate and persuasive man I ever met, end quote, but was less impressed by his reportorial skills, categorizing him as more of a promoter than a newsman. He was also deeply unethical. Karr paid a major correspondent for off-the-record material that correspondent had amassed and then passed it on to Pearson as his own work. He could stand in front of someone's desk and read documents upside down. One of his techniques for covering the State Department was to sit on a stall in the men's room and eavesdrop on conversations. Anxious to obtain a confidential report written by a professor who had just met with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, the man, Oskar Lange, was a professor at the University of Chicago. Ironically, it turns out he was also a Soviet agent. He later became an ambassador for the Polish Communist Party. Anyway, Karr misrepresented himself to Lange's secretary as working for Vice President Wallace, who allegedly needed the information about Lange's meeting. Karr copied the report, and it was subsequently published in Pearson's column. The FBI was called in to investigate, but the Justice Department declined to prosecute Karr. In his work for Pearson, Karr cooperated closely with a number of Washington officials later accused of espionage by Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers, receiving leaks and tips from them. But there is no indication that he knew they were spies, although he clearly shared their pro-Russian views. By 1947, the Cold War was underway, and both Karr and Pearson soon abandoned those pro-Russian views. Pearson endorsed the Marshall Plan, and Karr coordinated one of Pearson's major campaigns, something called the Friendship Train, to ship food and clothing from America to Western European nations to help resist communism. Was his conversion genuine? Karr did few things in life from conviction. More than likely, he recognized that in Cold War America, pro-communist leanings would impede his career. Pearson fired one of his employees for his communist affiliations after conferring with J. Edgar Hoover. But despite numerous investigations, the FBI had never been able to prove that Karr had been a party member, and Hoover admitted that to Pearson, who kept him on. In 1948, Karr re-inaugurated his campaign to flatter Hoover and the FBI, even disparaging his wife for some critical comments she had made about the FBI. He told one of Hoover's assistants that his wife was really an inexperienced news person and she didn't really understand what she was writing. He refused to support Henry Wallace's presidential bid in 1948, and he gave advice to Thomas Dewey's Republican campaign. But Karr decided in '48 to return to New York as vice president of the William Weintraub Public Relations Agency, no doubt concluding that continuing to work for Pearson would constrain his ambition. Karr's clients at the agency included Louis Rosenstiel, head of Schenley Industries, one of the largest liquor manufacturers in the world, and Pearson himself. Schenley was a staunch anti-communist, a close friend of J. Edgar Hoover, and a confidant of McCarthy's aide, Roy Cohen. That he was so close to David Karr, with all Karr's baggage, is illustrative of how Karr was able to charm very powerful men with very different political views. His career at William Weintraub was rocky. In 1950, he became a target of Senator McCarthy. In 1952, a congressional committee investigating the Katyn forest killings. This was during World War II. It was the Soviet murder of Polish POWs during its alliance with Nazi Germany. A committee investigating those murders heard testimony that Karr and the Office of War Information had pressured Polish newspapers and radio stations in the United States to tone down criticism of the Soviet Union for the massacre. Karr also evoked hostility from his colleagues at the agency. A man improbably named Norman who was one of the titans of American advertising, despite the name. He worked with Karr at the agency. He later took over the company. He recalled to me that Karr had tried to steal Norman's biggest client, Revlon, from him. He also accused Karr of blackmail, explaining that Karr would offer people Broadway tickets, comped hotel rooms, and prostitutes, then arranged to have a cameraman slip into the hotel room and take pictures. The only good thing about him, said Norman, was that he died young. Either forced out or, by his own account, anxious to run his own shop, in 1953, Karr set up an independent public relations business. He concluded that to deflect the communism issue, he needed a partner with impeccable patriotic credentials. He enlisted Major General Buck Lannon, a decorated World War II hero who had landed on Normandy, aide to General Eisenhower at NATO, and commander of the 1st Infantry Division as president of the company. Lannon joined Market Relations Network in January of 1955. He resigned in May, later telling a friend it was, quote, for reasons at least as grave ethically as one could imagine, end quote. Telling another that, quote, my ethical concept was repeatedly outraged and I would not accept it, end quote. I went through Lannon's papers, which are at Princeton, and there's lots of denunciations of Karr, but there's no indication of what those ethical issues were. Lannon informed his lawyer that friends had told him that Karr was alternating between threatening to destroy him and boasting that he could rehire him by snapping his fingers. Lannon issued his own threat, quote, he better goddamn sight not trying any fancy footwork with me from here on out, and that's a plain country barefooted warning, end quote. Karr shrugged off Lannon's departure and quickly developed a business niche, doing public relations in proxy fights for control of publicly traded companies. As in his other endeavors, he played dirty. During one struggle for control of MGM Studios, he was paid by the company's board to fend off a raider. But according to one of his ex-wives, he was meeting several times a week at night with the raider who was trying to seize the company. In 1956, he joined forces with a flamboyant Washington businessman and lawyer named Art Lange. Lange had intended to go to medical school, but he couldn't stand the sight of blood, so he decided that was a disqualifying factor, so he became a lawyer instead. The two of them perfected a strategy of fending off proxy raiders by counterattacking and trying to take over the raiders' own companies. Lange had first used this ploy to stop a takeover of the Fruhoff Trailer Company, during which, according to later congressional testimony, he paid kickbacks to the Teamsters Union to obtain money from its pension fund to buy stock in the raiders' firm. Karr and Lange were hired by the Fairbanks Morse Company, which was facing a takeover bid by a man named Leopold Silberstein. After a very complicated set of maneuvers, which went on for several years, Karr and Lange managed to seize control of Silberstein's company, Penn, Texas. During that long battle, Karr bribed Silberstein's secretary to feed him information. The fight was punctuated by charges in the Congressional Record by Francis Walters, chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the congressman whose district included the headquarters of Penn, Texas, that Karr's unscrupulous practices threatened American industry and the American way of life. Having swallowed up Silberstein, Karr and Lange then used Penn, Texas's stock holdings in Fairbanks Morse to ingest it in 1959, forcing out its owner, who had hired them to fend off Silberstein. And they changed its name from Fairbanks Morse to Fairbanks Whitney. In 1959, at the age of 41, David Karr became CEO of Fairbanks Whitney, a diversified company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, employing more than 5,000 people with a net worth of more than $70 million. Its most famous subsidiary was Colt Firearms. Its largest, Fairbanks Morse, was a maker of machine tools. His new position did not come without problems. He faced difficulties obtaining a security clearance for the defense work the company did because of his past, prompting still another FBI investigation that did not end until 1961. More problematic was that after a brief honeymoon, attributable to the end of the vicious corporate infighting that had consumed the company for years, it stagnated. Karr's major initiative for Fairbanks Whitney was a water desalinization process in Israel, launched with great fanfare in 1961, with Karr noting to the world press, quote, "This is one of the great scientific breakthroughs mankind has been waiting for since time immemorial," end quote. His hype quickly doubled Fairbanks Whitney's stock price. But predictably, the project faltered. The stock came back to earth, and the desalinization project was eventually abandoned. One reporter visited the construction site amidst all the hoopla and found it abandoned. His guide cynically commented that everyone in Israel was waiting for a miracle, quote, "for Moses to come back to earth and strike this stone with his rod to produce water," end quote. Disgruntled investors and stockholders denounced Karr's salary, $90,000 a year with a 10-year term, his company jet, and mounting losses. A profile in Fortune magazine likened Karr to, quote, "a ninth grader chosen to be mayor for a day," end quote. By 1962, he and Lange were quarreling. At the end of that year, the board of directors ousted Karr and brought in a new CEO who launched a full-scale reboot, noting, quote, "this is the worst company I've ever seen," end quote. Unemployed, albeit with a generous severance package, but undaunted, Karr now set his sights on show business. He formed a partnership with a Hollywood producer and one-time owner of United Artists and developed several movies, including The Money Trap and Dr. O's Welcome to Hard Times, and several Broadway shows. In Hollywood, Karr's life took a dramatic turn. Already divorced twice, he was engaged to a starlet and planning a round-the-world honeymoon when he met a wealthy French woman. According to his partner, After meeting her, Karr quickly checked her Dun & Bradstreet rating. He ditched the starlet, who had a nervous breakdown, quickly married the French woman, and moved to Paris with her, where her parents bought them a luxurious apartment complete with 5 servants and 2 butlers. Using her familial connections to the Rothschild family and to bankers at Lazard Frères, Karr brokered the sale of the iconic Georges V Hotel to Sir Charles Forte, the British hotel magnate, and became the general manager of the Georges V. Karr took to life in France, and with 5 servants and 2 butlers, who wouldn't? He befriended American ambassador Sargent Shriver, bought a yacht that sailed the Mediterranean. It later mysteriously burned to its hull, but he bought another one. And he advised both Aristotle Onassis and Armand Hammer on business deals. Karr later interceded with the Soviet government to enable Christine, Aristotle's daughter, to marry a Russian executive with whom she had fallen in love. The Russians agreed, but required her new husband to transfer about $500,000 of Onassis money to the KGB. Karr was also, during his time in France, up to his eyeballs in undercover intrigue. He wrote to his mother that he had done secret work for the Israelis. While working on the Desalinization project, he had befriended an Israeli bureaucrat who had his own very complicated and interesting history. This bureaucrat, Eliezer Preminger, had been the youngest member of the first Israeli Knesset as a communist, but he later cooperated with the Israeli Mossad as he moderated his politics. Preminger was working with Karr in Paris when Karr became friendly with a Palestinian businessman whose real job was to serve as the PLO's chief representative in France, and sub rosa was also a leader of Black September, the terrorist group responsible for the massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. That man, Mahmoud Hamshari, was assassinated by the Mossad in 1972. Karr and Preminger had met with the Mossad's Paris intelligence chief several times before that revenge killing. While I was not able to develop hard evidence that Karr had anything to do with the assassination, Preminger, according to his son, did work with Israeli intelligence, was very close to the Mossad and to the Mossad's man in Paris who had arranged for the assassination. And I think it's a plausible conclusion that Karr had helped set up Hamshari. Karr's business relationship with Armand Hammer inaugurated another new phase of his life. After being introduced by Sergeant Shriver, the 2 men developed a rapport. There were some obvious reasons. Both had been associated with the communist movement in their youth. Both were extraordinarily unscrupulous businessmen. Both had gigantic egos. The 3, Karr, Hammer, and Shriver, traveled together to Moscow in 1972 on Hammer's private jet. It was the first time that a private jet had entered Soviet airspace since the Russian Revolution. It was also a period when the Nixon-Kissinger policy of détente was taking off. Hammer struck a business deal with the Soviets to produce and sell fertilizer. Karr sensed an opportunity. He soon split away from Hammer and began to broker deals for American and European companies with the Soviet Union on his own. He created a partnership with Lazard Frères to finance Western projects in Moscow. He worked for Mitsubishi, Bluebell, Peugeot, Gulf Oil, and other multinational companies. During one of his many trips to the Soviet Union in the early 1970s, David Karr took another major risk. He was recruited by the KGB. A document published after the collapse of the Soviet Union called him, quote, a competent KGB source, end quote. His Soviet ties enabled Karr to become a very wealthy man. He arranged the financing for the Cosmos Hotel, the first Western-built hotel in Moscow since the Russian Revolution. He obtained the rights to market Misha the Bear, the symbol of the Moscow Olympics, and created a company in partnership with former Senator John Tunney of California to license the image. In partnership with Hammer, he had the rights to market the commemorative coins for the Moscow Olympics. All of these favors granted by the Soviet government led to a lot of money. His estate, when he died in 1979, was worth more than $15 million, the equivalent of $53 million today. What did Karr do for the Soviets? Well, he gave them reports on the 1976 presidential campaigns of his friends, Sergeant Shriver, Scoop Jackson, and Jerry Brown. He reported on meetings with Jimmy Carter. He attempted to worm his way into the confidence of members of the Gerald Ford White House, offering to convey policy proposals to the Kremlin and explaining Soviet initiatives. He set up a back channel for Ted Kennedy to communicate with Soviet leaders, during which Kennedy offered to work with them to combat anti-Soviet proposals that Carter had offered after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And by the way, that back channel was later used by Ted Kennedy. After Karr died, Kennedy wrote a letter, which was leaked from Russian archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which Kennedy offered to cooperate with Yuri Andropov to undermine Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. And he arranged for the Soviets to receive Western financing for important economic projects. So he's not a conventional spy. I mean, he's not stealing secrets. He's peddling influence and information. David Karr died suddenly at the age of 60. You thought he was like 80 years old after a life like that, right? He died suddenly at the age of 60 in Paris in 1979, just after returning from a trip to the Soviet Union after the opening of the Cosmos Hotel. He was about to be buried in a Paris cemetery when the burial was stopped by a court order obtained by his fourth wife. He ditched the French woman by now. Wife number 4 was a German model. At least 3 different people told me that she was a high-priced prostitute. Maybe, maybe not, who knows? She was a model. She was more than 30 years his junior, and she stopped the burial and lit a firestorm in the French press by charging that he had been murdered. And she named the suspects. It had been either the KGB, the Mossad, the CIA, or the Mafia. An autopsy concluded that he had died of a heart attack. But I went into this pretty thoroughly. I think he died of a heart attack, but an assassination cannot be entirely ruled out. At the time of his death, Karr was embroiled in several lawsuits, and the most consequential was one that had the potential to deeply embarrass the Soviet Union. This was a lawsuit which claimed that he had won the Olympic coin contract by bribing a high-ranking Soviet official. The high-ranking Soviet official was the son-in-law of Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. And as you may have noticed, the Soviet Union, now Russia, has a long history of assassinating people and trying to make it look like natural death. So it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but if he was assassinated, it was the Soviet Union. After his death, even more lurid rumors were published. There were charges that he and his Israeli friend had transferred Soviet weapons to Idi Amin and Muammar Gaddafi, that he had cheated the Soviets on the coin deal. And most spectacularly, a book published by a British journalist that claimed that he and Aristotle Onassis had conspired to assassinate Robert Kennedy. None of these were true, but they illustrate just how far David Karr had come from that middle-class Brooklyn home in which he had been born. Karr's estate was tied up in New York probate court for more than 10 years. It's one of the largest files at the probate court, just thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of disorganized pages. With 3 ex-wives, a mercurial widow, and 5 children, his personal life was even more complicated because in less than a year of marriage to his last wife, the German model, there had been 2 filings for divorce. In fact, the day after they were married in California, Karr had filed for an annulment, but withdrew it. Probate was further complicated by an outdated will. He had never changed his will after his divorce from the French woman. An alleged holographic will produced by the widow that was challenged successfully as a forgery, and charges of attorney misconduct. One of the string of lawyers used by the widow Karr was none other than Roy Cohen's law firm, which had a long-standing reputation as less than honest. In fact, one of the lawyers in that firm, the whole alleged holographic will, Karr had handwritten something promising to give a couple $1 million to the German model. And it's possible, it's difficult to know exactly what this was for. Possible this was a divorce offer. She claimed that she was going to be made a partner in all his companies. Anyway, she had this written note, and she sent it to the lawyer who notarized it and said it had been sworn before him on this day. Well, Karr had already been dead for a couple months. So it was an obvious, it totally destroyed whatever value that has. Then another one of her lawyers turned out not to be licensed to practice law in New York. He had been disbarred for fraud in Canada and failed to disclose it. As one judge said, he practiced law, but not legally. And then there were the holding companies in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Isle of Jersey, with complicated and opaque details about ownership and control of assets. Untangling David Karr's complicated personal and financial life took many years. My effort to understand his motivations and his behavior left me convinced he had been a communist, even if he had never formally joined the Communist Party. He had abandoned those beliefs to succeed in American life and employed his gifts, and he had a lot of gifts, to claw his way to success in American business and American life, using whatever means he needed to push aside competitors and rivals. He had cooperated with Israeli intelligence and later Soviet intelligence, not for any ideological reasons, but to make money and for the thrill of playing a role in exciting and dangerous activities. With his ego, he may well have believed he was using the Russians for his own purposes. Unfortunately, there have been other David Karrs throughout our history. American businessmen, ranging from Armand Hammer to Paul Manafort, have not hesitated to make corrupt deals with foreign tyrants and use their political connections to prominent American politicians to enrich themselves. I'm sure we will see more. Thank you.
I'll ask a question. You've done a lot of primary research. What's the next exciting thing on your horizon?
Well, I'm working on a project that the first result of which was published in something called Studies in Intelligence, which is CIA and the intelligence community's official journal a couple months ago, and then was picked up and was the subject of a front-page New York Times article in November. My co-author, John Haynes, and I discovered a fourth Soviet spy at Los Alamos that the FBI has known about him since the mid-1950s, but the American public has not. And his name was Oskar Lange, and he, his brother's wife, and her mother all defected to the Soviet Union in 1952. And Oskar and Stuart, two brothers, died there. And it's a great story. And still waiting for more material to be declassified. Maybe the FBI and the CIA will declassify that stuff before I die, but we'll see. So still stuff involving Soviet espionage, which is never ending. Yeah.
So what you said, it just puts everything into context, and we're not really in a worse situation now. Is sort of what I feel like. But for my question, maybe it's a little bit out of the realm, but do you think we have any chance if the Soviets are, well, now Russia, which we did Soviet Union, but influencing our election? I mean, can we?
Yeah, it's one of the things that there are a couple of things that are astonishing about what's happening today. One of them is that in the period that I was looking at in the 1950s, certainly the 1940s, 1950s, it was the Republican Party that was worried about Soviet influence in American life and American politics, and the Democratic Party that, oh no, none of, nothing happened. It's flipped, right? Very interesting. Another thing that's quite clear is the Soviet Union and now Russia has been trying to, and to some extent influencing American political life for decades and decades and decades. It goes back to the 1920s. It continued in the 1930s at a much higher and more dangerous level because there were large numbers of moles, Soviet moles, working in the American government, including people at very high levels, including Alger Hiss, who we now know there's simply no doubt was a Soviet spy. Harry Dexter White, who was the #2 man in the Treasury Department. There were dozens of people that were working for the Soviet Union and for Soviet interests. In 1948, Henry Wallace's presidential campaign was essentially a Russian operation. And
meaning they wanted him to
yes, his campaign depended on American communism and American communists and the Communist Party of the United States. So the Soviets have been trying to influence American political life for decades. You know, Karr is another example. Here was a guy who was close friends with lots of high-ranking American politicians. Karr had access to every American president from Franklin Roosevelt through Gerald Ford. There's one episode I described in my book where Karr came back to Washington from Paris in 60, I can't remember which year it was. What was the year that Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis? 64, 63, 64? No, it would have been 60, 66 or 67, I guess it was. Karr and Drew Pearson had a meeting with Lyndon Johnson in the Oval Office. This was the day after Johnson had announced he was not going to run for re-election. So it would have been 67, 68. There's no record of exactly what they talked about, but there's some hints in Karr and Pearson's correspondence, which suggests that Karr had learned that Jackie Kennedy was going to get married to Onassis, and that was going to damage Bobby Kennedy's presidential aspirations. You know, Karr was being used by the Soviets in various ways, and he was a man with lots of information and lots of contacts. So it's been going on for a long, long time. The revelations about Ted Kennedy, I think, should be extraordinarily disturbing to anybody. I mean, we have the written letters that Kennedy wrote to Yuri Andropov, and he's volunteering to cooperate in undermining Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, you know, two people at different ends of the spectrum. In fact, the document that named Karr as a KGB source was originally published in Izvestia shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union by a Russian journalist who was outraged that American politicians had cooperated with the KGB. She said, you know, these people are oppressing us, and you're supposed to stand for democracy, and here your politicians are working with these guys. Now, in that letter, it turns out that what Kennedy was doing was urging the Soviets to give a contract to John Tunney. So it was not, you know, ideological or anything, monetary, you know, give a contract to my friend, who's a partner of David Karr.
Did you interview Jimmy Carter for that issue of Kennedy?
Did not. Did not. There were several people I would have liked to have interviewed, but either they wouldn't see me or I couldn't get access to them.
Were there ever serious investigations of Karr?
Yeah, the FBI, I got his FBI file, which is enormous. And beginning in the late 1930s, the FBI was looking into Karr. They tried their damnedest to prove he was a member of the Communist Party, and they couldn't. They had occasional, somebody would say, oh, I heard so-and-so say he was a member. Well, that's not evidence, and so-and-so either was unable to confirm it or the FBI couldn't find so-and-so. Karr himself, one of his ex-wives, wife number 2, who actually lives in the suburbs of Atlanta. She's in her early 90s now, very, very interesting lady. She told me that, she said, you know, Karr had said to her, I was a member of the Communist Party. She said, he showed me his party card. Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Karr was the kind of person that could have been lying about that as well. It's just hard to know.
I mean, with all of his sleazy activity, did he ever, to your knowledge, come close to getting caught or charged for any of it?
No, you know, the FBI a couple times, you know, when he wormed his way into the secretary's confidence during the war and published this report about the guy's meeting with Stalin. The FBI looked into whether he committed, some kind of crime, and the Justice Department concluded it would be impossible to prove a crime. Karr's defense would be he's a newsman, right? And he's just digging for stuff, and he cuts a few corners. No, there's no indication that he ever seriously faced prosecution. He had all kinds of troubles. He had trouble getting a passport, for example, in the late 50s. And so he gave an affidavit to the passport office in which he trashed all his old friends. He said, so-and-so, yeah, I think he's a communist. He was deeply unethical, and maybe proof that a congenital liar is very difficult to convict of anything.
What's your take about the Soviets continuing to be involved in our election for this election?
I'm sorry, what's the...
Yeah, they apparently have been done with the previous election. What is your take that they will be continuing to do it?
I'm sure they will.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, the Soviet interference in the coming elections. I have no doubt that they'll try to influence them. For most of the time of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States has been by far the strongest and the stronger party. And as a weaker party, the Soviet Union has to use unconventional means to try to make its influence felt. And one of those means in the 1930s and 1940s, one of the weapons that the Soviet Union had was the American Communist Party and its sympathizers, which, the United States didn't have that advantage in the Soviet Union. There was no Democratic Party in Moscow or Republican Party in Moscow. And so the Soviets took advantage of that. Today, it's, through kind of cyber tricks and warfare. I have no doubt they'll continue to try. I have doubts about how influential the campaign was, the sort of the pro, anti-Hillary ads that were run several years ago. Did they have any influence? I kind of doubt it. What I think the bigger influence is that it sows mistrust and sort of an attitude of you can't believe anything that you hear. For example, in the 1960s, the 1980s it would be, the Soviets were spreading information that the United States had developed HIV in biological labs in Fort Detrick. Obviously false stuff. You go back during the Korean War, there was rumors that the United States had used chemical and biological weapons in Korea. So it's a long-standing practice, and it'll continue. I don't doubt that it will continue.
The Americans don't sit quietly by and not attempt to spy and influence Russian policy. How come the Russians are so much more effective than the Americans or the British? What have they got that?
Well, I think one reason that the Russians are more effective is that the United States is a democracy, and in a democracy, it's much harder to control sort of false news. The Soviet Union has various ways, some subtle, others very, very direct and brutal, to temper dissent and to frighten people. And for all the talk about, well, we're a Nazi state or a fascist state, the United States is an extraordinarily robust democracy where all kinds of opinions and lunacies are out there. And it's much tougher for the United States. We're not as good at it for whatever reason. even today, Russia is a much more closed, difficult society to penetrate than the United States is.
We've got another question up here.
Oh.
I think what you're doing with revisionist history is really exciting because it's giving us a better perspective of what's happened over the last 50 or 60 or 70 years. And there are a couple of shocks in your talk, which I really appreciated. And one was the Teddy Kennedy. I'm still having palpitations. I can't hardly believe that one. But the other one that came out a couple of years ago was that Ernest Hemingway was a KGB operative, which is, I really haven't recovered from that one. But Malcolm Gladwell, in his recent book, Talking with Strangers, he has an excerpt where it's part of probably our democratic aspirations, but then we always revert to or default accepting that the other person is speaking the truth. And what he found out in one of his episodes was that all of our agents in Cuba were actually working for Castro. Mm-hmm. But this is really sensitive because most people think that he was a villain and he was considered too zealous. What is your take on Eugene McCarthy?
Mm-hmm. Well, first on Hemingway. Hemingway agreed to work for the KGB. We've got declassified files in which they make the pitch to him and he agrees. Then for the next 4 or 5 years, they kept trying to get him to do something and he never did. In some ways, very typical of Hemingway. Oh yeah, I'll do that, and then blows it off. So he never did anything for them. Gene McCarthy, I'm sorry, Joe, I'm sorry, I thought you, yeah, Joe.
Sorry.
Yeah. Joe McCarthy is an interesting case. McCarthy, I've written this, McCarthy was right on the big issue. The big issue was Soviet infiltration in the American government. McCarthy was right. There was extensive infiltration. He was wrong on virtually every detail. Now, as a historian, the details matter. And McCarthy was a demagogue. And I think that McCarthy did enormous damage to the cause of anti-communism, which I personally think is an extraordinarily righteous cause. I think that anti-communism and anti-fascism are two of the lodestars of the 20th century. There were two totalitarian philosophies that were both extraordinarily vile and destructive, and the United States wound up defeating both, which was a great boon to mankind. So I think McCarthy did enormous damage to anti-communism because his charges were so wild and off the mark that genuine spies were able to sort of hide by saying, well, it's McCarthyism. See, I'm being falsely accused. When McCarthy accused George Marshall of being part of a conspiracy so immense, people like Alger Hiss could say, I'm being tarred by that same brush. And so I think McCarthy was enormously destructive. And he made his charges without evidence. So I think he was a real disaster in many, many ways. But he was right on the big issue. Does that excuse him? I don't think so. There were other people that were right about that issue and far more responsible and said it far earlier than McCarthy had.
Just a comment before we go on. Tolly Williamson arrived today with some news he wanted us to share. Apparently this evening, and he thinks it may be CNN, but somewhere on TV this evening, there's a special report.
At 9 o'clock this
At
evening.
9 o'clock this evening on McCarthy, that McCarthy. Continue.
Yes.
In your research process, what are the challenges of getting access to things like FBI and CIA files?
The biggest challenge is, well, time and bureaucracy. There are files that I requested 6-7 years ago that are still being dribbled out. And it can be extraordinarily frustrating. And then when they come out, there's large redactions that you're not clear exactly why. So that's very, very frustrating. The CIA is worse, as you would suspect. Soviet files for a while in the early 1990s, well, it was like the Wild West in Moscow. And you could get access to things, but that very, very quickly ended. Today, it's surprisingly, you can still get access to some files, others not so much. When I first went to Russia, the former Soviet Union, in 1992, shortly after the failed coup against Gorbachev. And I worked at an archive that had been the property of the Communist Party. And Boris Yeltsin had seized all the Communist Party's assets and had declared the party illegal because of its role in the coup. And so he opened this archive. And, you know, I described this to people. I was like a little 5-year-old kid in a cookie factory. Cookies just lying all over the place. And I was requesting files and getting files, all stamped all over with top secret. And you know, if you've worked in archives, you know that archives have control sheets where everybody that uses the particular file has to put their name down and the date and so on. And on many of these files, I was the first person to look at them. Even archivists had not looked at this stuff. So they had no idea what I was looking at. And in those days, there was only one Xerox machine in the whole archive. And the way it worked is if you wanted copies made, you wrote down what you wanted and you put a little slip in the folders. And then when you left, I was there for a month or 5 weeks. And when I left, they handed me 2 thick reels of microfilm. They'd made microfilm copies. And I was thinking as I was going to the airport and getting ready to go through customs, I'm leaving Russia with 2 reels of microfilm with documents stamped top secret. What could go wrong? And no problems. And my co-author and I, we produced several books out of this. The first one was called The Secret World of American Communism. And we reproduced these documents, which demonstrated that Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers had been telling the truth about Soviet espionage and the people they had named, in fact, had been spies. My co-author, John Haynes, went back to Moscow about a year later, and he was working in the same archive. And the SVR, which is the successor organization to the KGB, was actually at the archive. And they were investigating how we'd been allowed to see this stuff. And they were upset because they didn't care about the Communist Party part of it. The hell with the Communist Party. What they were concerned about, we had reproduced documents that we found in those files, which were messages from the head of the Communist International, which is a non-state organization, even though it was controlled by the state, but non-state organization, to the head of the KGB, which was a state organization. And so that bothered them. We shouldn't have been allowed access to that stuff. We actually published those documents, verbatim pictures of them. And those documents now, you cannot see them in Moscow. They have been re-secretized. I love that phrase. Even though they've been published in the West, they've been re-secretized. So, there's that kind of sensitivity. In the case of Karr's relationship with Israel, I tried 6 ways up and 10 ways down to get access to people in the Mossad, whether retired or current, or I had high-level contacts in the Israeli government, and the answer every time was sorry. So, there's still a lot of sensitivity to this material. There's stuff about Ted Kennedy, it's sensitive. When I first went to Moscow in '92, I actually went to do research on David Karr and his business dealings there. And I had no idea he'd been a Soviet asset at that time. And while I was there, I get over there. I've been told by this archive, oh yeah, you can have access to some of this material about his business dealings here. When I got there, the archive said, sorry, we don't have anything. It sounded strange, but all right. And so I'd gone to this other archive where I found all this other great stuff and got deflected from David Karr for about 25 years. But I found out later why. It was because of the Ted Kennedy connection. The Russian government, Ted Kennedy was still alive. They didn't want to embarrass him. They didn't want to cause problems. And so, no, you're not going to get to see any of this stuff. So, you work with what you have and you hope that you can, wend your way through. Yes?
Many of us are thinking this car story sounds an awful lot like Trump.
He wasn't as rich.
What are your thoughts about this?
Well, there's some similarities. Gigantic egos.
As it refers to a Russian operative.
I don't think Trump is a Russian operative. I think some of the people around him played footsie, and the most obvious one was Manafort, I think. Maybe General Kelly, not Kelly, Flynn, as well. I don't think Trump was a Russian operative. Trump strikes me as what he strikes me as. I think Karr in some ways was far shrewder than Trump. I don't think even if Twitter had been around in Karr's days that Karr would have tweeted. I think he was much better able to control himself. But there's some interesting parallels.
You can tell me more about the Ted Kennedy connection.
Well, Kennedy, Karr set up this back channel for Ted Kennedy. And after Karr's death, John Tunney was the guy that sort of maintained it. When these documents were published, and again, Kennedy was not a Soviet asset or anything like that. He was just willing, for his own political advantage, to work with the Soviets to undermine, in 1979, to undermine Jimmy Carter, whom he was preparing to run against in the Democratic primary, and then in the mid-1980s to undermine Ronald Reagan, whom he despised. When this stuff was published, it was published predictably by a right-wing newspaper, first in Britain and then in the United States, and it was dismissed. It's propaganda. It's an effort to destroy somebody. And John Tunney has never been willing to talk about it to anybody. And Tunney's papers at Berkeley are still closed. They're not available. And there's nothing in Kennedy's papers. Kennedy's closest aides also lied to me about Kennedy's involvement. I mean, I know I've talked to people who said that Kennedy and Karr cooperated on efforts to get several Soviet dissidents released, Jewish refuseniks. So I know that happened. Two of Kennedy's closest aides on that issue insisted they never even heard of David Karr, which is simply not true. And I think that they're protecting him.
What Kennedy did, isn't that very similar to what Trump is?
Well, it's very similar, I think, to what somebody like Paul Manafort did.
Can I ask you about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Were they guilty?
Absolutely.
Both of them?
Yes. Ethel was far less guilty than Julius. I mean, Ethel was not a spy. But Ethel aided and abetted her husband's spying. She was guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage, which was the charge she faced. There are dozens and dozens of KGB messages that we now have access to that explicitly name them as running a very, very important and significant espionage ring, only one part of which dealt with atomic espionage. And the only reason it dealt with atomic espionage was that fortuitously, Ethel's brother, who was a machinist, was assigned to Los Alamos. And we have the description that Julius wrote to the KGB about the meeting in his apartment in 1943 when he and Ethel met with Ruth Greenglass, his sister-in-law. She was going to go out to Albuquerque to see her husband, and they asked her to recruit David as a Soviet spy, and she agrees. Julius actually recruited a second atomic spy, a man who was never prosecuted, never really got on the radar. In one of our books, we were able to identify him. It's a man named Russell McNutt, who was an engineer friend of Julius, who worked at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. Well, he worked on facilities for Oak Ridge. He didn't actually live there. He lived in New York. And Julius recruited him, and the KGB was very excited about McNutt, and McNutt got an offer from this company to go down and live at Oak Ridge, and he refused because he was running a summer camp up in upstate New York, and he didn't want to give it up. And besides, he didn't want to take his family to Oak Ridge. It was, backwards, middle of nowhere, unlike New York City. So he refused, and the Soviets were livid. But he ended his cooperation with the KGB. By the way, he when we were doing this research and identified him, I found out he was still alive. Russell McNutt was still alive. And he had become the chief engineer for Gulf Oil. And when Gulf Oil built the town of Reston, Virginia, it was the company that built it was called Gulf Reston, a subsidiary of Gulf Oil. And the man in charge of building Reston, Virginia, where lots of CIA personnel live, the man in charge of building Reston, Virginia was Russell McNutt, former Soviet spy. He retired from Gulf Oil, and he developed a golf resort in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina with a Lee Trevino designed golf course. And he was still alive. I called him up and spoke to him on the phone. And he was reasonably friendly. And I asked him if he knew Julius Rosenberg. And he said, oh, yeah, he knew Julius. And then I said, well, I've got this information from KGB files that you turned over information to Julius Rosenberg. And he said, who did you say you were? And that was the end of it. He refused cooperation. But in addition to the two atomic spies, Julius ran an extensive network of industrial spies who turned over information on jet planes and radar and sonar. So he was a very, very important spy. Ethel, again, was a minor player, and she was arrested and charged and convicted because the FBI wanted to use her to pressure him. They did not have any usable evidence against virtually everybody else in his ring. They knew most of the names, but they had no evidence, legally admissible evidence. These cables that they had decrypted could not be used in court for a variety of reasons. So the only way they were going to convict these people is if Julius broke. And they figured he was refusing. They figured, well, we'll charge his wife, and that'll pressure him. What they didn't take into account was both Julius and Ethel wanted to be martyrs. And it's an extraordinarily sad story because they could have saved their lives. The government, up to the very moment of their execution, the government was saying that if you'll talk, we'll, no electric chair. The story that their kids have peddled for many, many years is, our parents couldn't talk because they were innocent. The only, to say that they're going to talk means that they're going to lie about their friends. They couldn't do that. Well, no, they were guilty. And they valued their loyalty to the Soviet Union and to the KGB more than they valued their own children, which is an extraordinary, it strikes me that psychologically.
That's why the children have to believe they were
I think so. Their kids now admit that their father was a spy, although they say a minor spy, but that their mother was totally innocent. Simply not true.
Harvey, I'm curious, as you said, you talked to some of the Karr family members. Did you talk to any of the kids, and how did that go?
Not really well. I managed to speak to 3 of his 4 ex-wives. The only one I didn't speak to was the first one, who were his wives were very, except for the German model, his wives were very accomplished women. The first one was the first female producer on 60 Minutes. But by the time I started the research, she wouldn't talk to me at the beginning, and then by the time I picked it up again, she had Alzheimer's. So the second one lives in Atlanta. Was very, very helpful. The German model, I actually, the French woman I interviewed in Paris, and she was helpful but cautious. The German model I interviewed by Skype. She's a piece of work. The 5 kids, the one that I really regret not being able to get to is the oldest son, who actually worked with Karr in Paris for a couple of years. And if there are any family papers, he's the one that got the papers. I spoke to him over a 20-year period 6 or 7 times, and he's always been very, very nice, polite, and I don't want to revisit this. I don't want to think about it. It's the past. He's a Buddhist teacher in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His son, who I talked to, said that his son said, my father was so psychologically damaged by David Karr that he just doesn't, he can't face that issue. I also spoke to one of his daughters. I gave a talk at Harvard on the book, who was very, very nice. And she said, it's just very hard to hear this stuff about my father. I spoke to one of his sons who lives in Atlanta, who does not think highly of his father. One of the stories he told me is he and his sister, these are the children of wife number 2, they would go in the summer when they were teenagers to Europe and spend the summer on their father's yacht. And he said once they get off the plane, and his sister, who at the time was like 13, comes walking up, and his father's there. And the first words out of David Karr's mouth to his daughter are, God, you've gotten fat. Imagine saying that to a 13-year-old girl. One summer, the son brought a friend along. And he said, Karr could be very intimidating. At dinner, he would give them quizzes about the news, and he'd get very mad if they didn't have the right answers. And once, after a couple of days, this friend, for some reason, got him angry, and he had his chauffeur drive the kid, who's 13 or 14 years old, drive him to the airport, buy him a ticket, and put him on a plane back to the United States. Another time, his daughter, by now was like 16 or 17, and she fell in love with one of the chefs on the yacht. And the wife told me that she actually got a letter from the chef's mother, about how, she was so happy about this, and she certainly hoped that this would continue, go on, they'd get married and so on. Perhaps fortuitously, perhaps accidentally, the chef had both of his arms broken. So all the kids, all of them were damaged by their relationship with David Karr, severely damaged. So, I wish I had access to particularly the oldest son, but you work with what you have.
You mentioned, I think, Sergeant Scible.
Mhm.
What was his role?
Shriver was charmed by Karr. He found, he would, when he was ambassador, Karr would come over in the afternoons. They'd sit in Shriver's office and sip whiskey and smoke cigars and talk. And Karr fully supported Shriver's race for the presidency in 1976, contributed money, traveled with him. In fact, in 72, Karr had traveled with Shriver when he was the vice presidential candidate. Actually, an interesting little sidelight, in fact, on American history. George McGovern's campaign was extraordinarily disorganized, and they hadn't really given a lot of thought to who the vice president would be, vice presidential candidate would be in 1972. After he wins the nomination, the guy they really want is Sergeant Shriver. Shriver happened to be in the Soviet Union with David Karr at the time, and nobody could reach him. And so they're scrambling, and they say, oh, Thomas Eagleton. Okay. So they put Eagleton on the ticket, and then it comes out that he had electroshock treatment therapy, and he had to be dumped. And Shriver gets added to the ticket later on. McGovern wasn't going to win anyway, but that certainly didn't help. Karr also, and it's not clear, well, it is clear he knew what he was doing. Karr's KGB controller was a guy whose name I'm blanking on right now, but Karr introduced him to Shriver. And he and Shriver became very, very close friends. This guy was a KGB officer, although that was not his day job. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this guy became the head in Russia of the Special Olympics, which of course was Eunice Shriver's big.
Oh, yeah.
So, and in a letter to Scoop Jackson, Karr suggested obliquely that he knew that this guy was KGB and that that was one of the reasons he wanted to get close to Sergeant Shriver. So, those are the kinds of favors he was doing.
So, okay, one more question from Lee, and then we'll wrap it up.
So what's your take on Putin? I mean,
Oh, that's an easy one.
Well, Vladimir Putin is a KGB thug.
but is he going to revive Russia to what?
He's trying, and he's a KGB thug, and that was the formative experience of his life, was his service in the KGB. He was not, by the way, a particularly successful KGB officer, but Russia is now being run by ex-KGB thugs. It's a criminal enterprise, and the KGB was a criminal organization, which for decades carried out assassinations around the world, and has continued to carry out assassinations. It's an organization that has left its mark, and it's not a very pretty mark. And he's a very formidable opponent at this point, partly because of what he learned in the KGB, which is that you do anything to win, anything and everything. And
at least they don't stand up and boast about the assassination. We need to thank Harvey for